Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the role of geographical mobility in intergenerational social mobility. As Chris said, talking about the linkage of the SLS to the Scottish Mental Survey 1947. So this is obviously work done with Chris Zuchang and Frank, who are all here today, and also Ian Deary. I work as part of ADRC Scotland, so we are interested in using administrative data and linked data. And here we're talking about some research where the kind of linkage of cohort studies to administrative data is going to help us to answer kind of some research questions that we previously couldn't do so well. And here we're looking at spatial mobility in Scotland, linking, as I said, the SLS and the Scottish Mental Survey 1947. And the question we want to look at is geographical mobility associated with better social class outcomes in adulthood? And so this linkage of this data allows us to explore factors across the life course that may be important. So we're able to link back to childhood social class and got measures of cognitive ability and education level. And also we're looking at historical migration, which suggests that this research has both current and future policy implications. So the background to this is around the theory of escalator regions and social mobility. So regional labour markets are likely to facilitate or preclude social mobility based on the type of employment that might be available and the different levels of employment within occupations. And the escalator hypothesis suggests that regions which offer positive job opportunities are likely to enhance the occupational success of those who move there. So an escalator region has been defined as a region where the density of high quality job opportunities not only increases the probability of somebody working in such a position, but also increases the likelihood of a person enjoying accelerated promotion because of a shortage of appropriate skills. So most of the previous research around escalator regions has focused on London and the South East and other large metropolitan areas. But there has been some suggestion that escalator regions effects may also operate within Scotland, where potentially major Scottish cities such as Edinburgh may operate as escalator regions. And other large Scottish cities might operate in a similar way, or perhaps due to the particular regional job market conditions, inhabitants in more depressed labour markets, and who are potentially thinking about maybe Glasgow, might need to relocate elsewhere to achieve occupational mobility. So there has been some previous research around the drivers of social and geographical mobility. A couple of previous studies which looked at the influence of cognitive ability and education on social mobility. And these found that both childhood IQ and years of education were positively associated with upward mobility. There hasn't been a great deal of research looking at the kind of personal characteristics of those who move and those who remain. So educational achievement has been associated with geographical mobility and the likelihood of occupational social mobility. So one study found that the success of migrants wasn't related to sex, age or initial occupational status, whilst another described a migratory elite with higher educational qualifications and advantaged childhood social class. And a 2012 paper by Van Ham et al. Suggested that Edinburgh and to a lesser extent Glasgow might act as escalator regions, and this was work using the SLS data. However, there doesn't appear to be much work or any work really looking at the impact of cognitive ability on geographical mobility to help determine whether place or person, or both perhaps, is important for social mobility. And this is kind of the gap of the literature that we are looking at. So I don't need to go into that. So it's not really clear why individuals in escalator regions do better than others. So it may be that that individuals who relocate do better because of the employment opportunities they're offered, or it might be more to do with particular characteristics of geographically mobile individuals. So if those who move to a region do as well as those who remain there and better than those who are located elsewhere, that might suggest it's the place itself which is important. Alternatively, geographically mobile individuals might have particular characteristics which therefore result in kind of more superior labour market outcomes rather than it being something that's particularly beneficial about the place. So we used the Scottish Mental Survey 1947 linked with the SLS to investigate the intergenerational, social and geographical mobility of this cohort, to look at what personal factors might be important, and we're looking at how spatial mobility impacts on social mobility, and particularly looking at whether large metropolitan regions of Scotland, such as Edinburgh, might act as escalator regions. So our research question really is geographical mobility associated with better social class outcomes in adulthood? And if so, is this some sort of escalator region city effect? Or is it something about the type of person who moves, where we're able to consider social class in childhood, cognitive ability at age 11, and educational qualifications, amongst other things? So just a little bit of background to our Scottish Mental Survey data. So as Chris mentioned, this is a cohort who were born in 1936, who then had their cognitive ability measured at age 11 in 1947. So it tested around 94% of the 1936 born population. So it was those who were attending a Scottish school on the 4th of June 1947. So they undertook a number of tests of cognitive ability. Just kind of one little example on the slide there of the types of things that were covered. So this is the SMS 1947. This is a kind of a large, nationally representative birth cohort. So it would seem an ideal cohort for life course research. But there was no real data follow-up between 1947 and 2000. In fact, the ledgers for the study weren't kind of found again until the late 1990s, which is what the second photo on the slide is. So linkage of this cohort to administered data can therefore help to fill in some of the blanks here. So our data sources for the project are the Scottish Mental Survey, for which we've got our measure of cognitive ability, and this is linked to the Scottish Longitudinal Study, which I obviously don't need to tell anybody here what that's all about. It's our semi-random sample of around 5.3% of the Scottish population. We also have linkage to the NHS Central Register. So this is a national register that was created in 1939, and the civil registration number from this was adopted as the NHS number. And this contains details of everyone registered with a GP, and all members of the SLS are flagged within this. And this contains details of all adults living in the household in 1939. So members of the SLS who were born in 1936 and therefore would have sat the Scottish Mental Survey were linked to the SMS and backward linked to the 1939 register to obtain parental occupation in 1939, which is kind of our measure of social origin, and then forward linked to obtain occupation from the 1991 census, which is our measure of social destination in midlife, where our sample would be age 55. And we're also able to get geographical variables from the census and the 1939 register to look at geographical mobility. So again, let's just kind of clarify where we got our variables from. So I say childhood, social class and geographical location from the central register, our measures of cognitive ability, and another couple of things we were able to look at the number of siblings and sex, and our measure of adult social class, educational qualifications and geographical location for our sample in midlife. So for our geographical data, we defined 5 geographical areas using council area. So we looked at Edinburgh, a wider west of Scotland area, not including Glasgow, Glasgow itself, Aberdeen, and the rest were all defined as other. And we defined geographical mobility as movement between these 5 different areas. For social class, we used occupation We used the HISCAM scale for 1939 and the CAMSIS scale for 1991. So CAMSIS is an occupation-based social class measure for 1991, which is comparable to the historical measure. And then we did a number of regression models to look at the role of geographical mobility with social class outcomes in adulthood. We were obviously able to include all the variables I've discussed already in the models, so we've got cognitive ability, educational qualifications, childhood, social class, sex, and number of siblings. So we looked at a number of different models. We looked at non-movers as one group as our baseline comparator. Then we did some models looking at those who remained in Glasgow as our baseline. And then we looked at a number of different models looking at movers versus remainers in each area. So looking at those who moved to Edinburgh compared to those who remained in Edinburgh, and the same for all our other areas. So just our kind of initial descriptive statistics, which I'll probably summarise probably more clearly in the next slide. So what we found really that was geographically mobile individuals tended to be from a higher social class in childhood, also tended to have higher cognitive ability, and were more highly educated than non-movers. But interesting, movers to Edinburgh and Glasgow had the highest cognitive ability, whereas movers to Edinburgh and Aberdeen had the highest rate of educational higher qualifications. But movers to Edinburgh and the wider West of Scotland area had the highest rates of social mobility. So in our first model, when we're looking at the likelihood of being in high social class in adulthood by geographical trajectory, and here we're looking at all remainers as the baseline comparator. So we've got, I'm sorry, might be quite small. What we've got is an unadjusted model, and then we have the model adjusted for social class in childhood, number of siblings and sex. We then add cognitive ability into the model. The next model includes education qualifications, but not cognitive ability. And finally, we've got our fully adjusted model. And then we just plot on the graph the unadjusted versus fully adjusted results for each of the destinations. So we've got, what we can see is that for movers to Edinburgh have the highest likelihood of being in a high social class in adulthood, and this is still found when we adjust for a number of these individual factors. Whereas a move to Glasgow initially seems quite advantageous, but this effect seems to disappear once we adjust for some of the individual level factors. And again, this is just similar models this time where we're looking at, oops, going too far. This time we're looking at remaining Glasgow as the comparator, and then this was similar patterns of results for our movers to the various different areas, but then we just wanted to look at whether remaining in other areas, how this differed from remaining in Glasgow, but there didn't seem to be anything terribly different about our remainers. And then finally we looked at I say movers versus remainers within each area, and again there's a similar kind of pattern of results where basically moving to Edinburgh seemed to be highly beneficial for being in a high social class in adulthood, and this still remained even after adjusting for individual factors. So to kind of sum up our findings, our results basically suggest that there are a number of different types of social class related geographical movement effects occurring. So where upward mobility moves are kind of only partly explained by higher education qualifications and cognitive ability. For example, the social class outcomes of those who move to Edinburgh are partly explained by higher education qualifications and cognitive ability, but there appears to be a kind of residual benefit of moving to Edinburgh. So this would appear to be both a person and place effect. Whereas upward mobility moves that appear to be more fully explained by the mover characteristics. For example, those like people who moved to, for those who moved to Glasgow. And then with some more complex effects were found where that were not particularly explained by the mover characteristics, where movers don't do better than non-movers, and this is found for the wider west of Scotland effect. And then when we found where movers do appear to do better than non-movers, but this was found for the kind of the rest of Scotland, which we're speculating may be something to do with some unmeasured kind of personal characteristics effect. We also found something that we're terming a flyover move, where we found that moves to a major city for those in a high social class in childhood were made to kind of maintain their high social class position. And this was people who kind of moved to Edinburgh and Glasgow. So the strengths of our sample are the representativeness of the sample. We were able to include a measure of cognitive ability, which hasn't really been done before, which is a kind of valid, a validated measure of this. And being able to include, look at both person and place effects. One of the major weaknesses was that we were only able to measure geographical location at age 3 and age 55, and we couldn't look at anything in between that. We had some fair bit of occupation in 1939 missing, which we're thinking maybe to do with conscription, so obviously we weren't able to include these people within our model. We also weren't able to determine why somebody might have moved, and we had a few issues with some small numbers, particularly our movers to Glasgow and Aberdeen. So we'll have to potentially interpret some of these results with a bit of caution. So to conclude, we would suggest that geographical mobility can lead to better social class outcomes in adulthood, but it does depend where you move to, and it would appear that both person and place are important for upward social mobility. And we're suggesting a few potential policy implications. Obviously, we have to be careful about where we're going with this, for having advantages found for Edinburgh and maybe not so much for Glasgow. But whether we should be promoting policies around geographical mobility to help kind of encourage upward mobility. But we also then obviously need to be looking at why some areas don't appear to be advantageous for social mobility.